NATO alliance has been a central feature. For 3/4 of a century, the transatlantic NATO alliance has been a central feature of the international security environment. It stood down the Soviets on the plains of Europe, would intervene in places like the Balkans, and in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the alliance's mutual defence clause was activated by the United States, setting the stage for troops from across the alliance to deploy to Afghanistan. But despite its immense military power, there have often been tensions running through the alliance, from debates over command and control to long-standing American objections about many allies not hitting their spending targets. But it's over the last couple of weeks where we've seen those tensions and dynamics shift dramatically and publicly, with apparent major US policy swings on the war in Ukraine, European security, and the relationship with Russia, all culminating in a fiery Oval Office event that illustrated these fissures in a way we haven't seen for decades. In the coming weeks, then, we have 3 major questions to ask. 1, what this all might mean for the US and its strategic position.
Fuck! Wait. Is there a banger tweet in here somewhere? I want Ukrainians and Russia to stop dying in a pointless war. I got one. Ooh. Okay. Anybody ever notice that I feel like the most feminist material I've ever seen in my life, like all the crazy feminists, I've seen all of it on like conservative platforms. I don't think I've ever seen this shit ever. I only see it because conservatives obsessively talk about it. Okay, sorry. Europe.
Position. Secondly, what this might mean for Russia and Ukraine. And thirdly, today's question, what about the rest of NATO? Asking what defensive capabilities they might have if the US splits from the rest of the alliance, and what it might take to become more security independent if that decades-old US security umbrella suddenly disappears. To do that, I'll start with a brief bit of history about the alliance and why the French might be treating this as a bit of an I told you so moment, scan through some of the recent indicators of a split between the United States and its NATO allies, and then the core substance of today's question. How much capacity do the Europeans and other allies have to defend themselves without the United States? What are their existing forces, their pain points, and what kind of investments might be required? Before closing out with some economic analysis of allied defense spending and their capacity to make this happen, and some—
Wait, that star thing, isn't that the NATO symbol? Fuck Hegseth, don't put him near that. He doesn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve it.
Some of the most important unknowns, like the future of Ukraine and its military in Europe's security architecture. But before we jump into it, quick word from a sponsor. Previously, I introduced you to Odoo, an all-in-one family of business software with 45+ business applications covering a range of purposes. For example, if you want to set up a website quickly, easily, and efficiently, their website builder has you covered. And you've previously seen me working on a Perun website using Odoo. But what if you wanted your website to be a bit more of a web store and integrate some e-commerce functions? Well, you've started to see me show that off too. With Odoo, it's simple enough. First, we generate our website, complete with easy-to-customize theme and layout. Next comes adding products, entering key info like the name and price, and then with a click or two, our product is created. It's then simple enough to customize the page by adding images or adjusting the layout using drag-and-drop content blocks. With some products in place, you could then set up an e-commerce function to help you get them sold. For example, you can enter your tax and banking details, establish invoice design, set up your delivery options and your payment providers. And just like that, you might be a long way towards your first sales. Odoo allows you to start launching your e-commerce store for free with its lifetime free first app offer.
Awesome.
That includes hosting and support, as well as a
sick,
personalized
guys.
domain name, free for the first year. So if you're interested, please do check out today's sponsor, Odoo. You'll find a link in the description. and I hope you're looking forward to seeing the website when it's
I
ready
am.
to launch later this year.
Hell yeah.
Okay, so while today we really do need to focus on recent events, I want to include just a bit of history on Atlanticism and the US-Europe security relationship in order to help us understand just how enormous a change we might be witnessing.
Okay.
With the major emphasis on the word might there, given how quickly all of this is developing and how many things are still unknown.
Okay.
While today we think of the USA as the world's predominant military superpower, it's fair to say that in the centuries leading up to the First World War, it was almost certainly Europe that had by far the more powerful armies and navies. Going into 1914, for example, the US Army would have been dramatically outnumbered not just by armies like the French, the Germans, or the Russians, but also by the likes of Italy and Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, the US Navy was growing, but significantly outmatched in terms of both numbers and displacement by the British Royal Navy. The way World War I played out, however, would dramatically adjust the scales. For some European states, World War I meant complete collapse. And even for the nominally victorious states, like Britain and France,
Well, I feel like it's an exaggeration. What World War I states collapsed after World War I? What?
it meant massive debts, the exhaustion of national resources, and a demographic hollowing out that would have society-wide implications. America, meanwhile, would build up its economic and military capacity, first by selling arms, equipment, and necessary supplies to the Entente states, while also building
Austria-Hungary? Yeah, they didn't collapse. Those are two countries that exist today, dipshit.
up its own forces both before and after their entry in 1917. And if World War I shifted that economic and military balance, World War II transformed it. This time, a lot of Europe's civilian and industrial infrastructure that had mostly survived the First War was wrecked from end to end.
Ottomans? You can get Ottomans in literally every fucking store in the world. They've taken over. They're wider than they ever have been.
The British and French colonial empires that had mostly held together in the 20s and 30s began the process of breaking up, sometimes peacefully.
Fuck, I shouldn't have said that joke in the beginning. That's going to end up on the Destiny vs. Destiny channel. I'm fucked! I'm fucked!
Sometimes not. To oversimplify, the Europe of the late 1940s and early 50s was broke, America was not, and in security, economic and financial terms, Washington held just about all the cards. They had an enormous fleet, roaring economy, and they had the atomic bomb. And with the Iron Curtain falling and the Red Army on the borders, the US would quickly move into the position of being the primary security guarantor of a new organisation called NATO. From an American perspective, that was probably necessary to stop Moscow dominating Europe and then turning its resources against America's interests. While from the perspective of the exhausted European states, it was just necessary. Full stop. As the Cold War evolved, we did see the military balance in NATO steadily shift. The US was always the alliance's most important military contributor, not least because they had the keys to the vast majority of the alliance's nukes, but many of the European armies also regenerated from their immediate post-war lows. By the 1970s, for example, the West German military, the Bundeswehr, was nearly 500,000 strong, and it was increasingly assumed that these European armies would do a lot more of the fighting and dying at the front if the Cold War ever went hot, while the Americans focused more on their comparative strengths, like slinging nukes and bombing people. A lot of supporters of the NATO arrangements then and now contend that America's support gave Europe the breathing room to regenerate its economy and military capacity. But there are always some sceptical voices, not least of which from Paris. President de Gaulle's relationship with NATO and Washington was especially complicated, and so probably not fully in scope for today's discussion. But among the core concerns were often worries about being overly reliant on American protection.
Cringe.
To oversimplify, if the shit ever did hit the fan, would America actually go nuclear, even if its own cities weren't at risk? Would they risk Boston to save the likes of Boulogne, Bergen, or Bristol? In what was not a cheap exercise for the post-war French economy, France would develop its own independent nuclear capabilities in the 1960s, and then field not just strategic nuclear weapons, but also tactical.
Can I? Okay. It's early, so I'm trying to be very careful with my rhetoric here, because you don't ever want to let Europeans think you're saying anything good about them. But I feel like one of the greatest crimes the United States has ever committed, and a lot of it had to do with 9/11 and the subsequent invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, is the shitting on the history of France. And the idea that like France is some weak loser fuck country that has never done anything or accomplished anything or are scared of like military conflict or whatever. Oh, I guess actually World War II played into it a little bit as well. But France has a glorious military history, and they helped us during the Revolutionary War. And they're a big dude.
Practical ones as well. Those vehicles on the right there, for example, are Pluton nuclear missile carriers, giving the French military access to a range of independent nuclear escalation options, besides just counter-value city busting. Some of those options would presumably have included nuking Soviet troops on German soil, which I imagine some French figures at the time might have considered a bit of a two birds, one stone scenario. Despite French skepticism, though, it's hard to argue that NATO during the Cold War era didn't accomplish its core mission. The implied goal was to deter a Soviet invasion of Allied Europe, and that invasion obviously never happened. Therefore, some of the tension behind the events we're now seeing play out probably originate more in the post-Cold War era, where every Allied power, including the United States, began to dramatically lower its military expenditure due to the absence of a Soviet-style threat anymore. But in a lot of European capitals, the peace dividend raiser gang would cut a lot more deeply than in Washington. As you can imagine, that debate over defence spending often drew very different perspectives, depending on which side of the Atlantic you were on. A European perspective might argue that, of course, American defence spending was higher, given the nation's global interests, while the threat to Europe was dramatically reduced by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then many of the former Warsaw Pact states actively switching sides, with forces like the Poles, Czechs and East Germans going from potential adversaries to allies. In Germany's case, some of its disarmament was even mandated by treaty, with the 1990 final settlement with respect to Germany, signed by among others the Soviet Union and United States, mandating steep reductions in force for the newly reunified German state. Plus, European troops would ultimately give their lives more often in American-led conflicts than vice versa. Meanwhile, from an American perspective, many in Europe were engaged in security free-riding. President Bush had pushed for the Allies to spend more on defence as far back as 2007. In 2014, the alliance had agreed a 2% of GDP spending target. But despite setting the target,
I'm not trying to imply anything, but I have a genuine question. Would a U.S.-Russia alliance, if it led to Russia no longer invading its neighbors due to reduced Western opposition, be overall beneficial to the U.S., even if it strained relationships with Europe? Or is maintaining strong ties with Europe far more valuable than any potential benefit from an alliance with Russia? No, Europe is a very valuable ally in terms of trade, economy, and ideology. So one thing that I've learned from the little bit I now know of, like, very little bit I know of, I guess, pre-World War I and pre-World War II Germany, of Israel-Palestine, and any other issue I guess recently I've actually read more into and dug into, is one thing that I've massively discounted in my life is how important ideology is and the thoughts and minds of people in a given country when it comes to conflict. It's not all about like economics or militarily advantageous or blah, blah, blah. Like things like ideology definitely matter. Another trend that I'm starting to see pop up, and I don't know if this will apply to every conflict that comes up or whatever, is there's something to be said for, not to be derogatory towards anybody, but there's something to be said for like a defeated empire. I don't know how, maybe if I get into post-World War II stuff, I don't know how, but somehow Japan lost in World War II and Germany lost in World War II, and they lost in a way where they were like, okay, this Reich shit is done. The Imperial Japanese, designs on Asia are done. Like, we are now changing completely, and we are moving forward into a new world where we see ourselves as belonging to this new world. So, for instance, after World War I, that didn't happen with Germany. Germany still felt itself as wanting to fulfill I guess what they saw as their ideas, I guess, of whatever Bismarck wanted, what they saw as, I guess, what would become the Third Reich. Germany didn't feel properly defeated after World War I in such a way that they were now being integrated into a new world. Palestine has never felt that way, obviously, and the Palestinians have never felt that way. And personally, I could be wrong, but personally, I don't think Russia feels that way. I think Russia still feels like a dispossessed empire. So all this to say, I don't know if Russia and the United States could ever share a platform, because the United States is not a defeated empire. Russia is, but Russia doesn't feel like it. I don't think Russians feel like it. I think Russians feel like they're just kind of like, they're like temporarily dispossessed superpowers, basically. That's what it feels like. But who knows? I don't know. I could be wrong on that. Or I could just fuck your mom.
Washington would often complain that many allies were slow to try and reach it, and essentially relying on the US military and US defense spending to make up the security deficit. And as far as the raw numbers go, Washington had a point. According to NATO expenditure data in 2020, only 9 members besides the United States hit that 2% target. Greece, the UK, Estonia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and France. Plus at 1.97%, will let Norway get in on rounding. 19 other countries fell short, with countries like Belgium and Spain basically phoning it in at 1%. It's worth saying, of course, that it's possible for all of those arguments to be true at the same time. It's possible that low European defence spending was in some cases understandable, that they did contribute to US-led missions, and the US was a major net beneficiary of the alliance as a whole, while it also been true at the same time that countries were falling short of their spending targets and relying on Uncle Sam to cover any gap. From there, though, I'd argue we've seen two inflection points. The first was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which seems to have given a number of countries in Europe a somewhat traumatic flashback and triggered a significant increase in spending. In 2020, 9 NATO states other than the US hit that 2% target. In 2024, it was 21. Some of those, like Poland and Estonia, were now spending more in percentage terms than the United States, and even most of those that were still missing the target, looking at you, Spain and Belgium, had still lifted their spending by something like 30% in percentage of GDP terms. You probably remember that at the time, there was a lot of hope these increases would solve one of the tensions at the heart of the NATO alliance, which, coupled with Vladimir Putin's very successful NATO recruitment efforts, would help tie the transatlantic alliance together even closer. As we've seen in recent weeks, though, since the election of President Donald Trump, that hasn't been how things have played out. And the big thing to say up front here is that while it's clear that things are changing, it's not clear how much they're changing. While it's long been expected and arguably attempted for the US to try and change the nature of its security relationship with Europe, planners have previously discussed some very different versions of what exactly that might look like. 3 scenarios you might want to imagine are a drawdown or burden shifting scenario where the US remains broadly committed within the existing NATO framework, but it decides to pull back some of the resources it dedicates to European security to put pressure on its allies to make up the difference. Not so much a change in policy or leadership so much as a change in resource levels.
Cool.
A more extreme scenario might be a larger scale military and political withdrawal, where the US essentially transfers responsibility for European security issues to the rest of NATO and its European partners, and basically says that while they're going to stay on the team, they're not willing to play captain anymore. A final, more dramatic option would be a true realignment. If drawdowns or withdrawals are about who funds the team or what America's position is on it, realignment covers scenarios where the US says it wants to be on a different team. And based on what we've seen out of the American leadership so far, I think there's still a lot of ambiguity over where future US policy is likely to sit, even if it's abundantly clear that it is changing. On the 12th of February, for example, the new US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference. In it, he appears to have put forward a vision of responsibility for European security shifting from the United States to the European allies. He said, and I quote, "The United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defence partnership with Europe," end quote. But he also said he was there to, quote, "directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe," end quote. He suggested the United States could no longer be Europe's primary security guarantor, and when it came to security guarantees for Ukraine to make sure the war didn't just start up again after Russia had had a breath to regenerate, he suggested the peacekeepers in Ukraine would not be American troops, that they couldn't be sent within the bounds of a NATO mission, and they wouldn't be covered under Article 5. You take that all together, and I'd suggest it sounds mostly like a burden-shifting agenda. The United States has to focus elsewhere, so European security and this Ukraine thing, that's a European issue. So far, though, there doesn't appear to be any consensus on whether America is actually planning major drawdowns of its military forces in Europe, even between different European capitals. The Polish president has reportedly said that he's received assurances from the US that there's no intention to reduce the number of US troops in Eastern Europe, but Lithuania's foreign minister has described the period where Europe could rely on American troops as essentially over, even if there was no expectation that that change would take place tomorrow. While the future of US military commitments, however, might still be uncertain, I think we actually have significantly more evidence of major policy differences potentially dividing the alliance. Remember that in just the last couple of weeks, Trump has said that 25% tariffs on the European Union are coming, that the bloc was, quote, "formed to screw the United States," end quote, refused to rule out the prospect of using military force to take Greenland, which is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO ally, and openly talked about making Canada the 51st US state, a policy goal which is fairly broadly opposed by some of the groups you'd expect to be involved in that kind of decision, like Canadians. And then if trade wars or debates over North American and Atlantic security weren't enough, we've also seen signs of major policy fissures over European security and specifically the war in Ukraine. What you can see on the right there is a photo from recent bilateral negotiations between the United States and Russia, hosted in Saudi Arabia, to which the Europeans in Ukraine were not invited, which, if you're a decision maker in a European capital, might raise a couple of questions. If the United States views the war in Ukraine as a primarily European issue and expects the Europeans to provide the money and peacekeepers to carry out any potential deal, why, some of them have asked, would it be the US negotiating the agreement? There's a very general rule that often holds in business as well as geopolitics that whoever's willing to put the money on the table, or in the case of warfare, the troops, is often going to be the one who gets the final say. And so the expectation might have been that if it was going to be the European credit card and European troops, including Ukrainian troops, on the table, that the Europeans and Ukrainians would have been at the table. We've also seen the United States very publicly break from previous allied positions on the war in Ukraine, most recently at the United Nations. There, following the third anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion, a resolution came up in the General Assembly to condemn the Russian invasion, endorse Ukraine's territorial integrity, and call on Russia to withdraw. A majority of the world's countries, more than 90, voted in favour, passing the resolution. A further 65 abstained, including the People's Republic of China. For its part, the United States actually voted against, joining such traditional American allies as Belarus, North Korea, and the Russian Federation, and officially publicly adopting a more pro-Russian position on this issue than China or Iran. Separately in the Security Council, where the US was able to introduce its own text, Russia voted in favour of the American resolution, which neither called Russia the aggressor nor acknowledged Ukraine's territorial integrity, while some traditional US allies issued fairly direct statements. The French ambassador reportedly said, quote, "There will be no peace and security anywhere if aggressions are rewarded and if the law of the jungle wins," end quote. While the UK ambassador said, quote, "No one wants peace more than Ukraine, but the terms of that peace matter. Only a just peace, one that honours the terms of our charter, will endure. And the terms of that peace must send a message that aggression does not pay. This is why there can be no equivalence between Russia and Ukraine in how this council refers to this war," end quote. And while all this has been playing out, you've also seen growing transatlantic tensions over other issues. For example, here's a recent quote from Germany. "Just look at the recent interference in the German election campaign by Mr. Elon Musk. This is a unique event. Washington's interference was no less dramatic, radical, and ultimately outrageous than the interference we observed from Moscow," end quote. And whatever your opinion on that statement or any of these statements, quotes like that do matter, because it came from this man, Friedrich Merz, who, after the recent German elections, is most likely to be the country's next chancellor. And despite once generally being regarded as falling strongly in the pro-American camp, as things have continued to escalate, it would be an understatement to say that Merz's position has shifted somewhat. Now, the clarion call of the hour appears to be for security independence. Merz reportedly said, quote, "For me, the absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that we can achieve real independence from the US step by step," end quote. We've also seen statements out of other NATO countries like the following from France, quote, "Although the Americans obviously remain our allies, we must no longer depend on them for our security," end quote. And even some of those in Europe who have been the strongest advocates of a very close relationship with the United States, Poland comes to mind here, with Prime Minister Donald Tusk recently warning against any power introducing what he described as some kind of competitive game between the European Union and United States. But even many figures like that, who are warning against a split, are still calling for major investments in Europe's own defensive capabilities. As for what those investments might be aiming to achieve, there are three elements I want to explore today. Firstly, sufficiency. How do the available resources compare to the likely tasks, like deterring Russia? Secondly, the replacement challenge. What's involved in making up for some of the key capabilities and elements the US currently provides? And finally, the magic I word, independence. What would be involved in putting the non-US allies in a position where they can make more of their security decisions with or without Washington's approval? Because putting on the defence economics hat for a moment, I'd argue it's probably not just about how many troops and how much equipment you have. It's about where that equipment comes from and who has a say in how you use it. Historically, at least some European commentators have been convinced that the United States would probably maintain its relationship with the European NATO allies, in part because even if some of the European nations were underspending on defence commitments, they were also buying a shit ton of American weapons. And that both helped generate scale in the US defence sector, which supported America's own defence capabilities, and transferred a lot of wealth from Europe to the States, creating often high-paying skilled jobs and driving tax revenues. But selling large amounts of American weapons, or even American components, also gave Washington another major policy advantage. When you buy from a country, you sign up to the conditions on how that product is used or transferred. And when buying American, that often means becoming very acquainted with four letters that I suspect will trigger a bit of an emotional response in many people in the sector. ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. Through ITAR and other mechanisms, the US can often exercise considerable control over how its allies use or transfer their systems, even if the US component is only a very small part of the greater whole. Back in 2018, for example, the US was reportedly able to put the brakes on transfer of a French jet, the Rafale, and an Anglo-French cruise missile, the Storm Shadow or Scalp, to Egypt, with the reported problem here being the cruise missile.
Putin unleashes Iskander-M missile attack to sink a container ship in Odessa, carrying cargo of British weapons for Ukraine. March 2nd. This was a couple hours ago. Is there like confirmation of this, or? Two Iskander-M ballistic missiles hit the Panama-flagged container ship MSC Levant F, reportedly Swiss-owned, soon after it arrived in Odessa on March 1st, after making a stop in Turkey. Two port workers were believed to have been wounded in the strike, which also damaged infrastructure, Ukrainian reports said. I don't see any confirmation yet.
Not the French jet itself. Some elements of the Scalp missile required US approval, and thus the whole missile did. Another example might be Saab's Gripen fighter jet. Overwhelmingly, that's a Swedish product. But that General Electric F414 power plant is red, white, and blue through and through. On one hand, those restrictions and controls can be used in a way that's eminently understandable. It kind of would have been awkward for the US to sell an F-35 to an ally back in the 2010s, for example, only for that ally to turn around to Beijing and say, hey mate, I've got something here you might be interested in. But at the same time, from a European perspective, it can open up the theoretical possibility of those same restrictions being used to constrain their policy options. If two different companies are in a competition to sell a fighter jet to a third country, one of them is probably going to be at a disadvantage if the other can decide that, yep, they're welcome to compete, as long as they do it without such optional extras as their engine, a third of their missiles, and some of their critical electronics. And as we've arguably seen in Ukraine, one of the most strategically impactful ways a country might choose to use its military equipment is by transferring them to a third country, something you might not be able to do if other countries control that export permission. It was Germany, for example, that had to give the go-ahead on other countries sending over their Leopard 2s. While even if the US didn't send any of its own F-16s, Washington still had to give the thumbs up to its allies choosing to do so. If allies want to be more independent of future US policy decisions, then it probably means having more systems in inventory, not subject to American logistics or American permissions. But in the context of defense industries that have become very intertwined over the past 3/4 of a century, that can be an expensive, difficult, but not insurmountable task. One big clue, then, about whether or not European and other allied leaders were serious about pursuing greater independence from the United States would be a market expectation of much greater investment and more purchases from European defence firms and other trusted suppliers, and perhaps a bit less emphasis on buying American products. And in recent weeks, we've seen a couple of movements on stock markets that might suggest a belief that, yes, European countries are likely to ramp up defence spending, but not necessarily a belief that they're going to be buying American. Noting, of course, that I hope that everyone listening to this understands that this isn't and will never be financial advice. As at time of recording, the German defence giant Rheinmetall is up about 31% over the last month. And if you look at the chart on the right there, it's more like 30% over the last 2 weeks. For no particular reason, you'll notice I've drawn a vertical orange line on the chart. That marks the approximate time of the Hegseth speech in Munich. And in what I'm sure is a completely unrelated phenomenon, the Rheinmetall share price appears to have started its lunar mission shortly thereafter. For Leonardo, the Italian giant, the gain was closer to 26%.
Fucking hope that, now that Ukraine is off the table for being part of NATO, that hopefully they can have a little bit of a resolution. Finally, he gets it. No, I never... The thing is that...
Is he switching his position on Ukraine?
So all of these things are true. I think Ukraine isn't perfect, but I'm generally on their side. I think the U.S. and NATO have done a lot to escalate tensions. I think Russia is a bad actor and an aggressor who's broken multiple deals themselves that are like secondary and also not related to NATO deals. They've also, all of these things are true. Like, it's not like one side is good and the other side is bad. I think that all sides are shades of gray. I don't know. Maybe that's crazy, but like I don't know. I mean, you guys keep sending me more stuff about it, and I'll keep coming to hopefully a better and better conclusion about it. Again, like I view my biggest strength is that I can remember a lot of things and make decisions based off of that many things, right? And so I view reading and learning about things as a massive advantage because, I mean, this is just like, maybe it's ego, right? But like, I can think about things with more context than most other people can because I just have a very good memory, right? And so because of that, I want to know everything that I can about something so I can talk about it in the best way, right? And so that's it. A nuanced take. Are your opinions correct? I mean, I would never put an opinion out there that I thought was wrong. and neither would you, right? Neither would you. Nobody would ever go and say, I think this thing and I know that it's wrong. So yes, obviously I'm going to have an opinion that, that I think is correct. Your thoughts on us calling out on Vance calling out forced Ukraine conscription, basically kidnapping people off the streets? So let me see if I can find this. So is it on his Twitter? Or JD at? So let's see here. It looks like.
Yeah, what's it look like?
I don't see the video of it at all. And so where can I find the video, JD? Maybe JD Vance conscription?
Like it's a draft. Yeah, what do you think? Like
is this
people,
gonna be it?
That's why it's a draft.
No, it looks like it seems like it's not. Is this the video here? Can I watch this video? Is this video acceptable for me to watch? Like, I just want to make sure that I can see it. Okay, yeah. All right, good. Because I saw this, and usually whenever somebody's being, like, grabbed by a big group of people on Twitter, this is like they're about to be beheaded or something like that. So I intentionally didn't watch this for that reason. So what does this say? J.D. Vance confronted Zelensky on the forcible mobilization, and this is what he means. And people are mercilessly grabbed.
What do they think mobilization means? Or conscription means?
Okay.
It's literally the opposite of a volunteer army, yes. Oh my, and they got the music? Oh my god.
They got him. Now, keep in mind that
fake. Is it? What do you mean? What's the source on it?
This is the military that's forcefully conscripting somebody, but I don't know if that's confirmed. I just wanted to make sure that.
What does conscription mean? Am I wrong, guys? I'm sorry. I thought conscription is when you forcibly.
It's a police car. Yeah, it could
make
be.
people join the military. Is that what conscription is?
It's plausible. Yeah, it's plausible.
Are there other definitions of conscription?
It is confirmed. Great. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, right? Because I mean, like, for all I know, it could be some crazy person just having an outburst. It's pretty obvious. No, it's not. I mean, the police do that here with people for other reasons too.
Like, do you understand that? Like, they're doing this on the Russian side as well, right? Assuming this is a real video, that they're also conscripting Russian soldiers as well,
There's
right?
a lot of videos. Okay. I read online that the Ukraine age of the draft is actually 25. Like over here, it's 18. Over there, it's 25.
It's not mobilization. This guy's actually being sent to Brazil. Shut the fuck up.
What is that? That's so awkward. Okay, give me a sec.
Wait. Isn't the idea around conscription that you should force people to serve under penalty of prison? Maybe I'm wrong, but we didn't drag draft dodgers to the military, did we? Wait, hold on. When you call somebody a draft dodger, the point is that they either illegally avoided being drafted or they found like a loophole out of the legal requirement for it. That's what a draft dodger is. You did have penalties in the United States if you avoided the draft. Yes. That's why it's a draft.
If anything, this really kind of makes me mad about our government, right? This makes me angry about our government, because if you look at this right here, in April, Ukraine reduced the mobilization age from 27 to 25, but in November 2024, the Biden administration pushed Ukraine to lower the draft age again, this time to...
Jake Bro wants to talk. What does Jake Bro want to talk about? Oh wait, this guy looks like he would agree with me, I think, just going by his video titles.
Where's 16 coming from? Where's the number 16? It was lowered to 18, not 16. So people just made that up. Okay, so people just made that up. Okay, there you go. And this is the problem, right? And this is why I don't mind covering this, is because people are just making things up the entire time. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for not doing research and not believing Russian bots. I actually usually, whenever I take something that a person says and I'm like, oh, that's true, it's like, oh, like there's a plane crash. Why did the plane crash? Oh, it's a woman pilot and it was DEI. Oh.
By the way, there are literally videos of Russians deliberately breaking their leg to avoid conscription. Yeah, to be fair though, I think like Americans do that to avoid getting sent back to the military as well. Remember the there was some guy who cut his cut his toe off? Does anybody remember this?
There's nothing wrong with your eyes.
Come on. I waited an extra hour just to make sure I got you.
Why?
I saw you limping out there. Vietnam?
How old do you think I am?
I don't know, Vietnam age?
Well, back in my day, the real Dodgers had the stones to run off to Canada or shoot themselves in the foot. They didn't come to free clinics whining for doctor's notes. Go hug your wife, tell her to get a babysitter, and be back in time to video the kids' first steps. Demeaning.
You're escalating to prove I was wrong about you.
Oh, they don't have it here. He cuts off his own leg. Rip. Okay, sorry.
We forced conscription as well with the draft. Like, I mean, I understand this looks very bad for Ukraine doing this, but like we forced conscription to fight
my God,
in
Aspen
Europe.
hit the
We
right
forced
talking
conscription to
point?
fight
What?
In, what do you call it? In Vietnam, right? It's the law. Yeah, the Russia and Russia does this too, I'm sure. And so let's see here. I'll see if there's any more instances of this, but there are a lot of these. JD was right about the forced conscription. Holy fuck, man. And it was criticized as well, not to this degree. I can't comment on that, to be honest with you. Like, that's, I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not true, right? And so, yeah.
Would Hassan be pro-Ukraine? He probably doesn't have strong opinions on it. It's probably boring to him.
Whenever politics fails. I've been on the draft list since 17 in Netherlands. Yeah. Like, I think that draft... I feel like I'm like a couple of years too old to be drafted now. So now I can vote for more wars again and I'll be safe. But, you know, before then, yeah, I was, of course, signed up for the draft. We all were, right? And so I feel like this is going to sound like a really, really heartless bad.
We weren't all. Remember, bring up the females.
And I see people being forcefully conscripted. This is the way a draft works in the military. Like, I bet if you went back 1,000 years, this is what happened 1,000 years ago with the Crusades, right? I mean, not exactly 1,000, but hopefully you guys see what my point is, right? And so...
What are the Crusades? Wait, what?
I don't know. It's just not heartless, just honest. Yeah, I'm just being honest, right? Like, because if you're a Ukrainian man and your country is being attacked, you have to fight for your fucking country. That's right. That's what I think. And it's the same as in the US. Like, I support the draft. I think we need to have a draft. Like, if we got attacked, if the United States got attacked, we'd want a fucking draft. That's it. And if we didn't have enough people, we would want a fucking draft.
Over the last month, with, again, a lot of that appreciation happening to the right of that orange line, while the Swedish Saab of Gripen and Carl Gustav fame has picked up more than 33%, with the gain since 12 February being even more dramatic than that, given the stock was in a bit of a dip at that time. Some of the Korean defense giants that have been selling a lot of equipment into Europe saw even larger gains. Hanwha Artillery and Aircraft, for example, have made major sales into countries like Poland, with a degree of production localization very much on the agenda. In what might be a small clue about what the market expects for future sales in that direction, it may be interesting to note that over the last month, Hanwha Aerospace is up about 70%. Suffice to say that, historically speaking, that isn't exactly average behaviour for large established firms. A gain of 70% in a month might feel closer to loans at mafia interest rates than regular stock market operations. And across the board, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars in market cap being created over the space of a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, in the US, stock prices were going in the other direction. At time of recording, Lockheed Martin has lost about 11% over the last month, General Dynamics closer to 7%. And in a way, that's consistent with a broader trend we've seen since the closing days of 2024. Over a 6-month horizon, General Dynamics has shed closer to 15% and Lockheed Martin 21%. I'll leave it to the audience to interpret the drivers and the significance of that opposite direction of travel. A broad takeaway here is probably that at the moment, a lot of NATO members are highly reliant and dependent on the United States for supplies of platforms, munitions, and permissions. And if there is a major policy push to change that, it might require not just significant investments, but that those investments be made closer to home. But
True! Bro, where is everything that conservatives told us existed for so long? Where is the military-industrial complex? I thought they controlled everything. Where's the military-industrial complex to force us to ship hundreds of billions of dollars more to Ukraine with the weapons? Where's the deep state to control U.S. foreign policy? Where is George Soros to save DEI and all our... Where are all of these huge mechanisms that supposedly existed controlling everything from behind the fucking curtain? I feel like none of these things exist. What's going on here? What the fuck?
Setting aside those industrial aspects of defense and policy independence for a moment, what about the more military elements? How would Allied military resources measure up against potential security challenges like deterring the Russian Federation, if you stop assuming that every war game, as I put it in the past, is going to end with Uncle Sam coming off the bench with the steel chair? If you take away Uncle Sam and his whacking stick, what's left in terms of troops and equipment? And as we go through this analysis, I want to flag that I'm looking at NATO without the United States because that's the military alliance, not the European Union. That means that mighty, mighty Canada, that is admittedly much more aligned on the Ukraine issue with European capitals than with Washington, D.C., is included in the data. Although given we're measuring military might, not politeness, it doesn't move the overall numbers that much. Some other non-EU inclusions, though, absolutely do. The UK is one of NATO's nuclear and naval heavy hitters, while, as we'll see a little bit later, Turkey brings a lot of ground combat mass to the table. Given that both are members of NATO and have been publicly supportive of Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, I'd argue they do belong in this data, along with countries like Norway. But just keep in mind that this isn't a purely European Union exercise. So we'll start with personnel counts, in part because one of the advantages we've seen Russia consistently try to leverage over the Ukrainians is the fact they've just been able to bring more troops and the larger military to the table. According to NATO data, in 2024, the US had about 1.3 million active duty personnel. The Russians had set a target, not yet hit, of 1.5 million active. And against those two massive forces, the rest of NATO, without their American component, could only muster a mere 2.1 million. The chart you can see on screen now shows NATO and military balance numbers for active, reserve, and paramilitary personnel, the United States on the right, and the rest of NATO on the left. Even if you don't count paramilitaries at all, where America doesn't really have an equivalent to some of the European forces, the advantage in active duty personnel was about 1.6 to 1, and the advantage in reservists about 1.8 to 1. If Russia's unachieved goal for a wartime force is 1.5 million, a mobilized US military would be more than 2 million strong, while for the rest of NATO column, the active plus reserve number is more than 3.5 million. Put another way, a mobilized rest of NATO military would be numerically competitive with American and estimated Russian forces combined, and a peacetime rest of NATO military has more personnel than Russia's target wartime military. Even if you remove the single largest contributor, Turkey, the numbers for the rest of NATO still stack up fairly favourably compared to the United States. And the gap between those manning levels has actually increased significantly over the last decade. By NATO figures, the US military actually shrank slightly over that time period, while the rest of the NATO states, including those that weren't members in 2014, like Finland and Sweden, grew their total forces by about 230,000. With the majority of that increase coming from just one nation, Poland, effectively boosting NATO troop levels on the alliance's eastern flank by something like 117,000. This basic relationship, where the United States spends more money overall, but it's the allies that have significantly more personnel, especially in potential combat theatres, tends to hold whether you're looking at Europe or the Asia Pacific. In a lot of escalation scenarios, it would generally be expected that the United States would provide a lot of the enablers, a lot of the firepower, and some of the most valuable combat units, but a majority of the mass, and presumably a significant majority of the casualties, would be borne by American allies, both because they have more personnel and because they tend to be closer to the potential line of fire. But while we've arguably seen in Ukraine that personnel counts can be absolutely vital, you can't exactly expect European militaries to hold off the Russians without equipment. Even a golf cart assault is going to be dangerous if you don't have anything to shoot at it. But at least on paper, for a lot of equipment categories, the non-US numbers are actually significantly higher than the American ones, and in many cases, significantly higher than what we might expect Russia to muster. As you can see on that chart there, with more than 6,300 tanks, the non-US states outnumber the American inventory by something like 2.4 to 1. And while no, you probably wouldn't want to take the likes of a Leopard 1 or M60 head-to-head with an American Abrams, there are probably going to be cases where mass matters, as does that ratio. For infantry fighting vehicles, it's 2.2 to 1. For self-propelled artillery, 3.5 to 1. And with a combined inventory of more than 25,000 APCs and infantry fighting vehicles, to say nothing of other related AFV types, that's presumably a lot of troops that aren't going to be walking. At sea, the on-paper advantage unsurprisingly shifts back to the Americans. The non-US states have more submarines in total, but the vast majority are smaller conventional boats, not the US nuclear-powered Leviathans. The non-US states have roughly 30 more principal surface combatants, but American ones tend to be higher displacement, often more modern, although I'd argue including the LCS in the US figures probably does inflate them a bit. But on the other hand, each American supercarrier also only counts as one, each of which could probably project more power than some of these national navies. If you were to contrast those non-US figures with the Russian Navy, however, things look considerably more rosy. And over shorter distances, in the waters they were designed to and trained to fight in, the lethality gap between some of those modern conventional submarines and the larger nuke boats might not be as wide as you would think. Finally, in the air, it's once again advantage US, but the difference in quantities very much depends on what category you're talking about. The US, for example, has a monopoly within the alliance on strategic bombers, and dramatic advantages on some of the tools that you might associate with the need to project power over longer distances. Where the numerical gap tends to be more limited is in things like multi-role and air superiority fighters, interceptors, and attack jets. The chart obviously doesn't capture the massive technological advantage that something like an F-35 in either US or European inventory might enjoy over older fourth-generation aircraft. But even without making that adjustment, if all you had to go by were these numbers on the chart, you'd probably conclude that American air power, Air Force, Naval, and Marine Corps is collectively much more formidable than the rest of the NATO allies. An observation which probably matches the expectation that the US would be a major air power contributor in any major armed effort in which NATO was involved. But at the same time, you'd probably expect that it's Russia that's the most likely opponent for the non-US NATO air forces, not the Americans themselves. Those non-US figures are still sufficient to give a significant numerical advantage over the estimated fighter strength of the Russian aerospace forces. Some areas, like strategic bombers, would obviously favour the Russians, while other fleet elements, like fifth-generation fighter count, would be dramatically in the Blue Force's favour. A broad personal observation here would be that while many of these non-US inventories do sometimes show sign of long-term underinvestment and other issues, there is actually an enormous amount to work with here. And so if the goal is sufficiency to deter a Russian threat or to replace the potential withdrawal of some US assets from Europe, it might be much more a case of solving specific issues and deficits as opposed to having to build from the ground up. So then,
why are F-35 so good? What makes them that good? I think it's because they use Intel instead of AMD.
Let's start to unpick some of those potential issues and challenges. What do you mechanically need to do in order to make this force capable of deterring Russia, for example, without US involvement or assistance, or at least with as little reliance on US assistance as possible? A lot of challenges here are going to flow from the fact that there has been plenty of time for NATO states to build their militaries with the rest of NATO in mind. On one hand, that makes great economic sense. You don't need to duplicate capabilities that everyone can share. You don't need 4 separate fleets of spy satellites, for example, if instead you can just have 1 or 2 and share the information amongst the alliance. Instead, countries can try to play to their strengths, specialise, and deliver as much value as possible with the funding they have available. One potential drawback of that approach, though, is that if you ever withdraw any of those presumed enablers, the rest of the force presumably becomes much less effective until those enablers can be replaced. And in the NATO context, indeed almost any context, the US is the king of a lot of these enablers. The non-US states have a lot of combat aircraft, for example, but are dramatically outnumbered when it comes to things like AWACS and tankers. And when it comes to satellites, whether that's missile warning, reconnaissance, or communication, there's really no comparing the US network to any of the others. Meaning if you suddenly strip all of that away, it would be kind of like the NATO alliance as a whole losing an eye. They'd still be able to see with their remaining sensors, but they'd lose that detail and metaphorical depth perception, leaving these kind of enablers as a potentially concerning gap. Now, obviously, Europe probably doesn't need as many of these types of assets as the US does because it's not really in the business of projecting power over long distances. The Polish Air Force probably isn't flying any trans-Pacific missions, nor does it have to go particularly far to come up against its primary opponent. Plus, because Europe is so compact and so heavily developed, you can put a lot more reliance on ground infrastructure. Wherever an airfight is taking place, it's probably not that far to an airbase or a civilian airport that could be repurposed for military use in time of war, and setting up a bunch of powerful ground radars and just pointing them east is probably going to give you a fairly useful picture. But you still might see European requirements here revised upwards if they no longer want to presume American support. Maybe in some cases it is possible to do without, but I'm not sure how many air planners out there would say they wish they had fewer tankers available. Then you'd have the twin challenges of fragmentation and deployability. Fragmentation is just shorthand for the general rule that, all else being equal, lots of small contingents from different militaries are going to have less combat power than those same resources concentrated in a single larger formation belonging to a single military. Even in the Ukrainian context where you only really have two main armies involved, we've still seen that concept play out, with Russia and now Ukraine moving to build up divisional and corps structures in order to better tie together and get the maximum possible performance out of their available lower-level units. The challenge then is how do you take contributions from smaller militaries that might only be able to contribute smaller units, say a single brigade, and glue those contributions together into something as cohesive and at least partially as effective as a larger American or French formation? How do you deal with the inefficiencies caused by things like duplication across multiple small forces, and all the other elements that can lead to an allied force feeling like it's lesser than the sum of its parts? And even if you can overcome that challenge, there's the issue of deployability. How do you actually get your units somewhere useful? For the American military, the solution is just to have an absurd amount of air and sea lift capacity. So you can just pick up entire formations, their personnel, equipment, and a couple of mobile Burger Kings, and send them anywhere in the world on relatively short notice. Meanwhile, for some NATO militaries, the challenge isn't much of a challenge. For troops in the Baltic states, for example, defensive deployability doesn't have to go that far beyond going outside, digging a trench in your backyard, and then waiting to see who turns up first, the Russians or the rest of NATO. But if your deterrence plan for Russia includes Spanish armoured formations, you better have a plan on how to get them from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic. Because even if you can snag a couple of thousand last-minute Ryanair tickets, I'm not sure how you're going to go getting a Leopard 2 into checked baggage. In other words, it's not enough just for these NATO states to have the people and the equipment. They're going to need a plan on how to form those into useful combat formations and get them where they need to be, which, given the current state of the Russian Navy, probably isn't a surprise amphibious assault on Portugal. A final technical challenge to flag is standardisation, or rather the lack thereof. Make no mistake, NATO has succeeded in standardising in a dizzying array of areas. But compared to major military forces like the People's Liberation Army, the Russian military, or the US military, the other NATO states operate a dizzying array of equipment. As an extreme example, the US has one type of main battle tank, the Abrams, plus whatever you count the Booker as. The Europeans also have the Abrams, but also various versions of the Leopard 2, the Challenger 2, the Leclerc, the Italian C-1, the South Korean K-2, various Soviet, former Yugoslav or former Warsaw Pact designs, Leopard 1s, M48 patterns, M60 patterns, upgraded M60s with a 120mm gun, soon the new Altay main battle tank from Turkey, and that isn't even everything. That obviously limits your ability to run joint logistics or share replacements and spare parts in a crisis. And even when you talk about things that sound like they should be standardised, like 155mm artillery shells, you'll find that even there, the curse of proprietary solutions has managed to worm its way in over time.
I don't know if it's, I think it's the case that like everybody uses standard ammo now, right? Like all NATO countries are like 5.56 is called a NATO round, right? Or 9mm or 45 or 380 or whatever, or 40 the caliber, I guess some people use that. But I think back in World War I, and I think maybe even in World War II, I think like every single country had like their own fucking bullets. I think like my uncle used to have a bunch of old rifles from I think World War I and World War II, and like every single rifle had its own unique bullshit ass fucking ammo. I don't know how standardized it was back then, but Jesus.
To the point where not every 155mm system is rated to fire every 155mm round, which again is just going to be another factor working against any attempt to make all of these little contributions greater than the sum of their parts. And that note about ammunition feeds into another area where reliance on the United States has been rather high. Historically, the United States has been the country in NATO with the largest stockpile of artillery ammunition, cruise missiles, or just about any relevant munition you care to name. And while there are a lot of factors that go into explaining why a lot of countries have arguably underinvested in maintaining their own stockpiles, part of the issue might have been the comforting belief that in the event of a crisis, America's stockpiles would come to the rescue. The problem comes when you realise the United States stockpile is only so large, and there are a lot of US allies that might be making that assumption. So while the United States might be well positioned to supply its allies in the event of a European escalation, or an issue in the Middle East, or an Asia-Pacific crisis, if you're worried about multiple issues potentially flaring up at the same time, or America not agreeing to supply things when you need it, you potentially have a problem. This is an example of the kind of thing that isn't immediately apparent when you just look at counts of platforms.
Okay, I don't need a fucking Odyssey level accounting of every single thing in the military, all right. I thought this was a meme, but apparently... We do have military mobile Burger Kings? Wait, do we have a designated NATO round just so making ammo for allies is easier? Yes, I believe the M4 platform uses 5.56, and I believe the 5.56 rifle round is called, I think that's called a NATO round, isn't it? I think we all basically use the same ammo now for our guns in the West, right? The most terrifying capability of the United States military remains the capacity to deploy a fully operational Burger King to any terrestrial theater of operations in under 24 hours. Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan, May 2004. Just don't look up the new potential replacement rifle rounds. I thought the new cartridge was supposed to be pretty cool. Is that not the case? Oh, nice. Okay. Vance is leaving early. FAA changed the Burlington TFR, and his departure is now, or it's between now and 1:45. I'll have to when the motorcade comes through Richmond. What happened? Can somebody explain the logic here? That some of these videos on YouTube now, this why is there no time listed? So I don't know how long the video is. Why would they ever think that's a good idea? Am I missing something, or is there...
Hundreds of protesters were lined up along Route 100 in Waitsfield this morning, voicing their opposition to Vice President J.D. Vance and the Trump administration. Vance is in Vermont for a family ski trip at Sugarbush Resort, and his visit is sparking mixed reactions due to his controversial policies. NBC5's Yunia Martinez was at the rallies, speaking with both sides about the VP's visit.
This was a scene in Waitsfield on Saturday. Hundreds of protesters from all over state filled Main Street, protesting Vice President J.D. Vance's family trip to Sugarbush Resort.
What kind of power? Every human being has a right.
Maria Reyes, who moved to the U.S. from the Dominican Republic in search of better opportunities.
That was some... If Mike, the workout dude, rolled his R's, they would sound like that. My God.
Says the decisions made by under the Trump administration could jeopardize everything her family has worked for.
I just feel like we're taking like a million steps back. America is supposed to represent opportunity, de salir de un país que uno cree que uno no puede ingresar, no puede salir de la violencia.
Her frustration resonates for many in
we got a lot of Spanish speakers in the U.S. Can I get a translation though? Fuck you. What the fuck?
The crowd as signs and chants fill the air calling for change.
Our democracy is at risk, and we have people who don't care about people.
This country's in a lot of trouble right now, and we can't keep going down this route.
As the hours passed, the crowd only grew. But just 9 miles away in Warren, the scene was very different. A crowd gathered there to greet Vice President Vance with open arms.
When we saw that there's 3 protests, we thought, well, we better have a little welcoming committee come out and just at least show our support.
I thought that was unbelievable that J.D. Vance would come to a blue state. And it just shows what kind of an awesome, normal guy he is.
Wow.
As opinions clashed on both sides, many expressed that regardless of political differences, everyone has the right to be heard.
J.D. Vance is here skiing, and he has a right to be with his family. He's the Vice President of the United States, and this is fine that they're protesting. I'm okay with that. I'm just here to show my support.
The divide in Vermont reflects the larger national conflict, with protests happening throughout the country since the Trump administration took office.
They're going to continue and grow until, sadly, till they claim martial law. So, yeah, it's going to grow. Keep going.
In Waitsfield, Yunia Martinez, NBC5 News.
Damn. He peaced out. He's going to Moscow to ski now. Sorry, I'm done. Vance is a really shitty skier. Honey has hair floating all over this room. Fuck! Whoa! Oh yeah. Are we supposed to know which one is him? Is it? Was he the guy that crashed, or is it this one? Okay. Do they have Secret Service that are experts in skiing? Yes, and they have Secret Service that are experts in banging your mom. Why don't you make a proper response to Atria calling calling your ass out on gold investment. What? This was like months ago, dude. And I already did. He's just factually incorrect when he says that sometimes it's a good investment. We looked at the charts. There's like no time. My response is point out like a 10-year time period where it was better to invest in gold than the markets. I don't know if there is one. I don't know if there was a 5-year time period. True. Why the fuck won't Trump just turn on the damn water? Let it flow. Why didn't he rake the forests? Why is he withholding water from the people of South Carolina? Do you see how psychopathic this sounds? Fresh and Fit invited to Mar-a-Lago. Well, I think Mar-a-Lago is a club that anybody can go to, right? Like, I don't think you have to be invited. Or did they get a special invite? You could probably also get a special invite too. I have no idea. But otherwise, I'm pretty sure it's like you can just go to Mar-a-Lago, right? I don't think there was anything else. I got shit I'm doing today. Like, yo mama. Did you set up a time with Hunter Ash? I don't know. I should debate him on. What do we have to... He did respond favorably. I just don't know what we should talk about. Monday at 2 p.m. ET. What is that? That's tomorrow, right? Like, what is this guy even... He's also a Trump guy? Pardoning of Eric Adams, Doge's role in the government. Holy shit. What is this? New Playbook DC. Last month, a group of moderate Democratic consultants, campaign staffers, elected officials, and party leaders gathered in Loudoun County, Virginia for a retreat where they plotted their party's comeback. We got their takeaways. Those gathered then laid out 20 solutions where Democrats can regain working class trust and reconnect with them culturally. 1. The party should embrace patriotism, community, and traditional American imagery. 2. Democrats should ban far-left candidate questionnaires and refuse to participate in forums that create ideological purity tests, and move away from the dominance of small-dollar donors whose preferences may not align with the broader electorate. They should push back against far-left staffers and groups that exert a disproportionate influence on policy and messaging. Candidates should get out of elite circles and into real communities, e.g. tailgates, gun shows, local restaurants, churches, and the party needs to own the failures of democratic governance in large cities and commit to improving local government. Holy. Please, God, yes. So this is a random group of no power downs? Oh, it seems like a think tank or whatever. Who knows if it'll manifest in anything, but... Okay. Wait. One question while we do connections. Okay. Where are my gun people at? What's the coolest pistol caliber carbine to buy? Sell it to me. Sell me the coolest one. .7mm? No weird ammos. Fuck you.